I have made 2 cups of coffee every morning for 41 years. The first one I drink. The second one I made for Carol. After she died, I kept making it anyway. Old habits don't ask permission before they outlive the reasons that built them. Every morning I made 2 cups, drank one, and poured the other down the drain. 19 months of that. It sounds like grief. It was grief. But it was also just muscle memory. The hands know what they've always done, long after the mind has accepted what it can no longer change. The morning everything changed began exactly the same way. 2 cups. First one down, second one waiting. I had a routine checkup at Swedish Medical Center that morning. Nothing serious. The kind of appointment a man my age keeps because his doctor insists, and because, at 65, you've learned that ignoring small things is how they become large things. I sat in the oncology waiting room in a row of mustard yellow chairs, holding a paper cup of water that tasted like the building it came from, waiting for my name to be called. That's when she sat down beside me, small, older. A burgundy cardigan that had been washed too many times. She moved with the particular careful economy of someone who has learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't necessary. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me. Not the way strangers look at each other in waiting rooms, which is to say, not at all, but directly, with the focused and unhurried attention of a person who does not have time left to look at anything the wrong way. She said, "If anyone gives you vitamins or supplements, anyone at all, even someone you love, put one in a full glass of water before you take it. Leave it overnight. Don't take anything until you've done that." I almost smiled. I thought she had the wrong person. I started to say so. Then she said my name. My full name. Walter Briggs. And then she said Carol's name. My wife Carol, who had been dead for 18 months, whose coffee cup I still made every morning out of pure muscle memory and poured down the drain. The paper cup of water went still in my hand. "How do you know those names?" I asked. She looked at me with the steady patience of someone who has made her peace with most things and is working through a short list of what remains. "Carol would never forgive me," she said quietly, "if I didn't try." A nurse called her name. She stood, slowly, straightened her cardigan, and walked away without looking back. I sat in that mustard yellow chair and did not move for a long time. 3 days later, my son Derek called. He sounded easy, warm, the way he always sounds when he thinks he's doing something good. He said he and his girlfriend had found something for my health, a supplement, high quality, he said. Something to help me feel stronger going into winter. He sounded genuinely happy about it. Almost rehearsed in his happiness, the way people sometimes are when they have told themselves a story enough times that they have started to believe it. That night I went to my workshop, filled a heavy glass measuring cup with water, and dropped 1 capsule in. I left it on the workbench and went to bed. By morning, the water had turned the color of weak tea, pale brownish yellow, wrong in the way that quiet things can be wrong before anyone notices them. I stood in my workshop at 5:30 in the morning with that glass in my hand, and I understood. The water, the color, the woman in the burgundy cardigan who had known my dead wife's name. The supplement my son had delivered with a warm smile and a rehearsed kind of happiness. I understood all of it, and I understood that I was still alive because a dying woman had kept a promise she had made to my wife. A promise Carol had asked her to keep long before either of us knew it would ever need to be called upon. This is that story. Every morning, I make 2 cups of coffee. I have done this for 38 years. The first cup is mine. Dark roast, no sugar, ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle that I never got around to replacing. The second cup sits on the counter until it goes cold. Then I pour it down the drain. Then the next morning, I make it again. Carol has been gone for 18 months. I am not confused about this. I know she is gone. I know the second cup serves no purpose. I know that a man of 65 who has spent 4 decades as an aerospace engineer at Boeing, a man who built his entire career on precision, on doing things the right way for the right reasons, should be able to stop making a cup of coffee that no one drinks. I have not been able to stop. My name is Walter Briggs. I live in a 3-bedroom house in the Northgate neighborhood of Seattle, Washington, 2 miles from the Boeing campus, where I spent 38 years of my working life. The house is too large for one person. Carol and I bought it in 1991 when Derek was 3 years old, and we believed, the way young people believe things, that the space would eventually fill itself with noise and life and the particular disorder of a family in motion. The space did fill, for a time. Then Derek grew up and moved to Bellevue, and Carol got sick. And now it is just me and the 2 cups every morning, and the quiet that a house makes when it has absorbed enough of a life to know how to hold its shape without the people in it. The garage is where I go when the house gets too loud with that kind of quiet. I converted it into a workshop 12 years ago. Workbench along the back wall, pegboard for the hand tools, a decent table saw that Carol pretended to find excessive and secretly liked because it meant I stayed close to home on weekends. She called it my happy place. She was not wrong. There is something about working with wood that a career in aerospace never quite replicated for me. The material is honest. It tells you when you have made a mistake. It does not wait until 30,000 feet to let you know. There is a table in the workshop that I have been building for 2 years. White oak, 4 chairs, meant for the dining room. Carol picked out the design from a woodworking magazine in the spring before her diagnosis. She tore the page out carefully and set it on my workbench without saying anything. That was how she communicated things she wanted without wanting to appear to want them. A torn magazine page, a quiet placement, a departure from the room. 38 years of marriage, and I learned to read those torn pages the way other men read direct requests. I started the table 6 months after she died. I have not finished it. This is not because I lack the skill or the time. I have both. It is because finishing the table means placing it in the dining room, and placing it in the dining room means sitting at it alone. And sitting at it alone means acknowledging, in a way I have not yet been ready to acknowledge, that the person who tore that page out of the magazine is not coming back to see it completed. I am working on being ready. Some mornings I get closer than others. This particular morning, a Monday in January, the sky outside the workshop window doing what Seattle skies do in January, which is commit to a shade of gray that suggests it has given the matter serious thought and arrived at this color deliberately. I was sanding the underside of the tabletop when my phone rang. Derek called every Sunday. This was Monday. I noted the difference the way I note any deviation from an established pattern, not with alarm, simply with attention. The call was short. His voice was even, the practiced evenness of a man keeping something out of his tone that belongs in it. We talked about the weather. We talked about the Seahawks. At the end of it, before he hung up, I heard Natalie's voice in the background, his girlfriend of 2 years, a woman who called me Dad on her 3rd visit before I had offered it. She said, "Tell Dad we miss him." Derek repeated it. I said thank you and ended the call. I stood in the workshop for a moment after, sanding block in hand, the table half finished in front of me. I thought about the word miss. People say it the way they say other small words, quickly, without loading it, as filler between the things they actually mean to say. I have learned, in 65 years of paying attention, that the words people use as filler are sometimes the most accurate words they have. Sometimes miss means exactly miss. And sometimes it means something else entirely. Something the speaker has not yet decided to name. I set the sanding block down. Went inside, made the 2 cups, drank one standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the backyard. The oak tree Carol planted the year we moved in was bare and exact against the gray sky. Every branch exactly where physics required it to be. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. Honest, like the wood in my workshop. The 2nd cup sat on the counter and went cold. At 9:47, my cell phone rang again. Unknown number, Seattle area code. I answered on the 2nd ring. The habit of a man who spent 4 decades on call for systems that did not wait. The voice was a woman's, older, careful, the way careful sounds when it has been practiced over a long time for a specific purpose. She said, "Mr. Briggs, my name is Margaret Yuen. I was Carol's friend. I need to see you in person. It's urgent." I looked at the 2nd cup of coffee on the counter, still warm enough to see a faint curl of steam rising from the surface. I said, "How did you get this number?" She said, "Carol gave it to me. She said I might need it someday." Outside the kitchen window, a crow landed on the oak tree's lowest branch. Sat there, looked in at me with the flat, assessing attention that crows have, that makes you feel briefly that the assessment is not going in your favor. I told Margaret Yuen I would meet her the following morning. I poured the 2nd cup down the drain. I did not sleep well that night. Swedish medical center smells like decisions that haven't been made yet. I have never found a better way to describe it. Not antiseptic, not illness. Those are part of it, but they are not the thing itself. The thing itself is the particular quality of air in a place where people sit and wait to be told something they already half know. I have sat in this waiting room 11 times in the past 18 months. The first time was the night Carol died. I sat in this exact room at 2 in the morning and did not know what to do with my hands, so I held them together in my lap and looked at the floor and waited for someone to come tell me what to do next. No one came for a long time. I still come back every month for the routine checkup Carol made me promise to keep. She extracted that promise 6 weeks before she died, in the particular way she had of making requests that were not quite requests. A specific look, a specific silence, the sense that the correct answer was already decided, and she was simply waiting for me to arrive at it. I keep the appointments because I promised. That is the only reason. I am 65 years old, and I have not missed a promised appointment in my life, and I do not intend to start now. The waiting room was half full on that Tuesday morning. The chairs are the color of old mustard, a choice made by someone who either had no opinion about colors or had a very strong one. I took the seat nearest the window, the one that looks out onto the parking structure, because looking at a parking structure requires nothing of you emotionally, and sometimes that is exactly what a room full of sick people's relatives needs. I had been sitting for 11 minutes when she came in. I noticed her the way you notice something that moves differently from everything else in a room. Not faster, not slower, but with a different quality of intention. She was small, 75, maybe 76. White hair cut short and neat. She walked with a cane she clearly did not always need. She held it slightly away from her body, the way people hold things they have recently been given and have not yet decided to accept. Her coat was a deep burgundy wool, well kept, the coat of a woman who bought good things and maintained them carefully. She took the seat beside me, not the seat across from me, not the seat 2 chairs down, which was also empty. The seat directly beside me, close enough that I could have passed her something without leaning. I noted this and said nothing. For 2 minutes, we sat in the kind of silence that waiting rooms produce. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable. Simply the shared silence of people who have agreed without speaking to exist in the same space temporarily. She looked at her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were swollen, the specific enlargement of long-term arthritis, the kind that comes from decades of precise work. Then she said, without looking up, Your wife used to talk about you every time I saw her." I turned to look at her. She was still looking at her hands. She said you were the most stubborn man she had ever met, and that this was not a criticism. I said, "You knew Carol." She said, "For 20 years. We worked together at Boeing, accounting department, 3rd floor. We had lunch together every Tuesday and Thursday from 1987 until the plant reorganization in 2007. After that, we had coffee on Saturday mornings until she got sick. She talked about you at every single one of those lunches and every single one of those coffees." I looked at this woman, this small, careful woman with the arthritic hands and the barely used cane, and tried to understand how Carol had known someone for 20 years and I had never once heard her name. The answer, when it came to me, was simple. Carol had a whole life I was not part of. Not hidden from me, simply hers. The way the workshop was mine. The way some things belong entirely to one person, and that belonging is not a subtraction from the marriage, but an addition to the person inside it. Margaret Yuen, I thought. I should have known this name. She turned to look at me then. Her eyes were dark brown and very still. The eyes of someone who has had a great deal of practice receiving difficult information without letting it move across her face before she was ready. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" I said I could. She said, "Someone is going to give you vitamins. It may have already happened, or it may not have happened yet. When it happens, when someone close to you offers you a supplement, a capsule, anything you are meant to swallow, I need you to test it in water first. Drop it in a full glass of water and leave it overnight. Do not take it before you do that. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I looked at her steadily. I said, "Who is going to give me vitamins?" She said, "I think you already know the answer to that question. I think that's why you're sitting here looking at me the way you're looking at me, instead of asking me if I'm confused." The PA system called a name that wasn't mine. Someone across the room stood up and gathered their coat. I said, "How do you know this?" She opened her mouth. The nurse appeared at the hallway door and called Margaret Yuen. She stood. The cane went under her hand with the ease of something she had practiced. She looked at me one last time with those very still dark eyes and said, quietly enough that only I could hear it, "Carol would never forgive me if I didn't try." Then she walked toward the nurse and the hallway door, and I watched her go until she turned a corner and was gone. I sat in the mustard-colored chair and looked at the parking structure through the window and tried to remember how to breathe at a normal rate. My hands were in my lap. I looked at them the way I had looked at them on the night Carol died, wondering what they were supposed to do with themselves when the situation exceeded anything they had been trained for. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. Derek. A text message. "Hey Dad, coming over Sunday. Got something good for your health. Can't wait to see you." I read it twice. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and sat very still in the waiting room of Swedish Medical Center and thought about a glass of water. The drive home from Swedish Medical Center takes 14 minutes on a normal Tuesday. That Tuesday it took 23. I know this because I checked the clock when I pulled into the driveway, and I remembered checking it when I left the parking structure. And the difference was 9 minutes longer than it should have been. I could not account for the 9 minutes. I had no memory of stopping at a light longer than usual or taking a wrong turn. What I had was the vague sense of having driven a familiar route while my mind was somewhere else entirely. The particular autopilot of a man whose body knows the way home well enough to manage without him. I sat in the driveway with the engine running for a while. Margaret Yuen had known Carol for 20 years. She had known my name, known Carol's name, known enough about me to find me in a waiting room on a Tuesday morning in January. She had delivered a specific warning about a specific thing, vitamins, water, overnight. with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the words and decided on their exact order. And then she had left before I could ask the question that mattered most. A confused person does not rehearse. I had spent 38 years at Boeing, learning to distinguish between systems that were malfunctioning and systems that were operating exactly as designed. The distinction mattered. A malfunction was random. A system operating as designed had logic to it, a sequence, a purpose built in from the beginning. What Margaret Ewan had done in that waiting room was not a malfunction. It was a system operating exactly as designed. The question was, who designed it, and when? I turned off the engine and went inside. The house was the temperature it always was when I came back to it. Slightly cooler than comfortable. The temperature of a space that had been waiting rather than living. I turned the heat up 2 degrees. The same 2 degrees I turned it up every time I came home, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the counter where the second cup of coffee had sat that morning before I poured it out. Derek's text was still on my phone. Got something good for your health. I had been turning those words over since the waiting room. The specific phrasing of them, the cheerfulness of them, the way they sat alongside Margaret's warning, like 2 pieces of a picture I did not yet have enough of to see whole. Something good for your health. People said things like that. Sons said things like that to fathers who lived alone and did not eat enough vegetables and worked too long in cold garages. It did not mean anything specific, except that a woman with 20 years of Carol's confidence had sat down beside me that morning and told me it did. I made a sandwich I did not taste and ate it standing at the counter. Then I went to the workshop. The table was where I had left it. The top surface nearly finished, the legs assembled and waiting to be attached. The whole thing held in a kind of suspension that I had been maintaining for months. Close enough to done that I could see what it would look like. Far enough from done that I could still pretend I had a reason to keep coming back. I ran my hand along the sanded surface. Smooth and even, the grain of the white oak visible under the shop light in long, honest lines. I said, I met someone today. A woman named Margaret Ewan. She says she knows you. I do this sometimes. Talk to Carol in the workshop. Not often. Not in a way I would describe to another person. But occasionally, when something happens that she would have had an opinion about, I find that the opinion arrives more clearly if I speak the situation aloud into the space where she used to stand in the doorway and watch me work. I told her about the waiting room. I told her about Margaret's eyes, how still they were, the stillness of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had arrived at the moment of setting it down. I told her about the warning. Test them in water first. Leave it overnight. The workshop did not answer. It never does. But there is a quality of silence in a room where you have said a true thing out loud that is different from ordinary silence. Heavier, more settled. The silence of a fact that has been acknowledged rather than avoided. I said, Derek is coming Sunday. I picked up the sanding block, put it down again, looked at the table. 38 years of engineering had given me a reliable instinct for the moment when a system required intervention. Not alarm. Alarm was for people who had not yet learned that panic consumed the time and energy that diagnosis required. What I felt standing in that workshop on that Tuesday night was not alarm. It was the specific, clarifying attentiveness of a man who has identified a variable he did not previously account for, and is now revising his model accordingly. Margaret Ewan had spent whatever energy she had left, and from the look of her, from the cane and the careful way she moved, she did not have unlimited energy left. To find me in a waiting room and say 8 words. Test them in water first. Leave it overnight. 8 words, precisely chosen, delivered to a man she did not know, on behalf of a woman who had been dead for 18 months. That was not nothing. That was the opposite of nothing. I went back inside at 9:30. Looked through the cabinet under the kitchen sink until I found what I was looking for. A glass-sided measuring cup, heavy-bottomed. The kind Carol had bought because she said thin glass felt dishonest in your hand. I carried it to the workshop and set it on the corner of the workbench, in the clear space beside the table saw where the light was best. I did not know yet what I would put in it. I knew I would need it Sunday. Sunday was 5 days away. I went to bed at 10 and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling, and thought about a man who drives home 9 minutes slower than usual and cannot account for the time. Then I thought about Carol, and the 20 years of Tuesday and Thursday lunches I had never known about. Then I stopped thinking and listened to the rain against the bedroom window. The steady, indifferent Seattle rain that fell on everything equally, on the house and the workshop and the oak tree in the backyard, and the 2-year-old table that was almost finished, and the glass measuring cup sitting on the workbench waiting to be useful. I slept eventually. Not well, but enough. Natalie walked into my house the way water finds the low point in a room. Naturally, without appearing to try, as though the space had been waiting for her specifically. She came in first. Derek was still at the car. She had 2 grocery bags over one arm and a smile that had been in operation since before she left Bellevue. She was 30 years old, dark-haired, dressed in the careful way of someone who had thought about what to wear and arrived at something that said effortless without being effortless at all. She said, "Dad, it's so good to see you." She had been calling me Dad since her 3rd visit. I had not offered it. I had filed the noticing away and done nothing with it, because there was nothing obvious to do with it yet. She went directly to the kitchen without asking. Not to the living room, not to the hallway, the kitchen, as though she had a destination already decided. She set the bags on the counter and began unpacking, with the ease of someone who knew which drawer held the wooden spoons and which cabinet held the Dutch oven, without opening the wrong one first. She had been in my kitchen 4 times. I counted them while I watched her. The smell reached me before I identified the source. Pot roast. The low, slow smell of beef and root vegetables cooked since morning. Carol made pot roast on the first Sunday of every month from October through March. A specific ratio of broth to wine, adjusted by instinct, never written down. The result was always the same, the kind of smell a house holds for a day and a half after the dish is gone. I said, "That smells like Carol's recipe." Natalie looked up and smiled. She said, "Derek told me how she used to make it. I've been practicing." Derek had not been present for most of those Sunday pot roasts. What he remembered would have been general at best. The smell, the color of the broth. Not the ratio. Not the instinct. I did not say this. I said it smelled wonderful and set the table for 3. Derek came in 10 minutes later, thinner than the last time, his jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with a Sunday visit. He kissed me on the cheek, the brief, habitual press of someone executing a long-practiced gesture. I put my hand on his shoulder, felt the tension there, and said nothing. We ate at the kitchen table. The pot roast was good. The ratio close, not exact, but close enough that eating it required a conscious effort not to think about who was not at the table. Natalie asked about my sleep and appetite and knees. Questions spaced naturally through the conversation. The way questions land when they have been planned but deployed carefully. Derek did not look at me during the meal. Not once. He looked at his food, at the window, at Natalie when she spoke. I passed him the bread. He took it and looked at the bread. 33 years I had been reading my son's face. Each time he could not look at me, he had known something he was not telling me. After the plates were cleared, Natalie reached into one of the grocery bags and produced a small white box. High-end packaging. No loud colors, no excessive text. The kind of restraint that signals quality. She set it on the table in front of me with the casual placement of something already decided. She said, "Omega-3 and vitamin C, Dad. Derek mentioned your knees. The omega-3 helps with inflammation. Completely natural. I had my doctor look them over." She said it smoothly, the smoothness of words rehearsed and adjusted for their landing. I looked at the box. Then I looked at Derek. He was looking at the box. Not at me, at the box. His right hand flat on the table, the stillness of deliberate control. The focused attention of someone waiting for a specific outcome. I picked up the box, turned it over once, set it down. I said, "Thank you, sweetheart. That's very thoughtful." Natalie smiled. Derek exhaled, barely, the smallest release of held breath. I noted both. They left at 3:15. Natalie hugged me at the door with practiced warmth. Derek hugged me after, tighter, longer, the hug of a man who has something to say and cannot say it. I felt the tension in his shoulders and did not comment. I watched their car disappear down the street. Then I went to the kitchen, picked up the white box, and carried it to the workshop. The glass measuring cup was where I had left it, corner of the workbench, best light. I opened the box and removed one capsule. Smooth, white, standard size. Nothing about it looked wrong. I held it between two fingers for a moment, the way I held any component I did not yet trust. Close enough to examine, far enough to evaluate. I lowered it into the measuring cup, added water until the capsule was fully submerged. Cut a square of plywood and laid it across the top. I turned off the workshop light. Back in the kitchen, the house still smelled like pot roast. It would hold the smell until tomorrow afternoon. Carol's ratio of broth to wine. Close enough to replicate, not exact enough to be hers. I stood at the counter and thought about the difference between close enough and exact. In aerospace engineering, close enough was a category that did not exist. Close enough was how accidents happened. Close enough was what you said when you had stopped paying attention before the job was actually done. I went to bed at 10. The rain started sometime around midnight. The steady Seattle rain that fell on everything equally and asked nothing of anyone. Across the yard in the dark workshop, a capsule sat in a glass of water and did whatever it was going to do. By morning, I would know whether Margaret Ewan had used her last good days on something real. I want to stop here for just a moment. Before Walter goes back to that workshop, before he sees what's in that glass, I need to ask you something honest. If someone you trusted handed you something and called it a gift, how long would it take you to question it? How long before the doubt would quietly set in, the way it does when something feels almost right, but not quite? Think about that for a second, because Walter had one night to find out. One night, one glass of water, and one workbench in a garage that used to be a place he built things with his hands. What he found when he walked in there at 5:15 in the morning, I don't think he was ready for it. I don't think any of us would be. If you're still with me right now, drop any number in the comments. Just one number. It doesn't matter which one. I just need to know you're here, because what comes next is something no one should have to sit with alone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This story is far from over. Let's go find out what was in that glass. I woke at 5:15 and did not make coffee. This was the first morning in 38 years that I had not made coffee before doing anything else. I noted the deviation the way I noted all deviations, without drama, simply as data. The fact that I had bypassed a 38-year habit without conscious decision told me something about where my mind had been while I was sleeping. I pulled on my work clothes in the dark and went out the back door to the workshop. Seattle in January at 5:15 in the morning is a specific kind of dark. Not the full dark of rural places, but the muted, amber-edged dark of a city that never fully turns off. The motion light above the workshop door triggered when I was 4 steps away, the way it always did. And for a moment, The backyard was sharp and clear and shadowless. The oak tree, the fence line, the workshop door with the small rust stain above the handle that I had been meaning to sand down for 2 years. Everything exactly where I had left it. I went inside. The measuring cup was on the corner of the workbench where I had placed it the night before. The plywood square was still across the top. The shop light above the bench came on when I pulled the cord, and the workshop filled with the clean, even light that made everything look the way things looked when you were about to examine them seriously. I removed the plywood square. I want to be precise about what I saw, because precision is the only honest way to describe it. The water was not clear. It was the color of weak tea, a pale, brownish-yellow tint that had no business being in a glass of tap water that had been clear 12 hours earlier. Not a dramatic color, not the color of something that announced itself. The color of something that had been trying to pass unnoticed and had not quite managed it. I looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then I went to the utility sink, filled 2 more glasses with fresh tap water, and returned to the workbench. I opened the white box and removed 2 more capsules, from different positions in the tray, one from the top layer and one from the bottom. I placed one in each glass, covered both with pieces of plywood. Checked the clock on the workshop wall. 5:23. I did not go back inside. I sat down on the stool beside the workbench and looked at the first glass, the one from last night, and thought about the 38 years I had spent learning to trust instruments over instinct. The principle was sound. Instruments did not have preferences. They did not want the reading to come out a particular way. They simply reported what was there. The water in the glass was the color of weak tea. That was the instrument reading. I picked up a pencil and turned over a piece of scrap wood and wrote down the time I had placed each capsule and the time I would check the results. Then I wrote 3 words in the margin and looked at them for a moment and did not cross them out. Not vitamin C. At 8:45, I removed the plywood squares from the second and third glasses. Both were the same color as the first. Not identical. One was slightly darker. One was nearly the same pale yellow. But both had changed. All 3 glasses of water, 3 capsules from 3 different positions in the same box, had produced the same result. I lined them up on the workbench in a row and looked at them under the shop light. 3 glasses. 3 vitamins, 3 identical results. I am not a chemist. I could not tell you from the color of the water what substance had dissolved into it, or at what concentration, or what it would do to a person who swallowed it. What I could tell you, what 38 years of working with systems that did not forgive mistakes had taught me, was the difference between a result that was anomalous and a result that was consistent. Anomalous results had explanations. A bad batch, a reaction to the tap water minerals, a capsule that had been improperly sealed and had begun to break down. These were possible. These were the explanations a man reached for when he wanted the reading to be wrong. 3 consistent results did not have those explanations. 3 consistent results meant the reading was right, and what the reading showed was what was there. I sat on the stool for a long time. Outside the workshop window, the January light was doing what January light in Seattle did, arriving without conviction, gray and non-committal. The light of a sky that had decided to show up, but not to commit to anything. A crow landed on the fence line, the same crow, or one exactly like it, and looked in through the window with the flat assessment that crows brought to everything. I thought about Derek's hand flat on the table, the stillness of deliberate control, the exhale, barely audible, barely there, when I had accepted the box. I thought about Natalie moving through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had been in it 100 times. I thought about Carol's pot roast. Close enough, not exact. The ratio approximated by someone who had studied it without living it. And then I thought about Margaret Ewan, 75 years old, arthritic hands, a cane she did not always need, sitting in a waiting room on a Tuesday morning to deliver 8 words to a man she had never met. I thought about what it cost a woman in her condition to find a stranger in a hospital and say what needed saying, and then walk away before the stranger could ask her to explain. I looked at the 3 glasses on the workbench. I picked up my phone from beside the table saw where I had left it when I came in. No messages. The screen showed 5:42. I had been in the workshop for over 3 hours. I stood up, looked at the table, the unfinished white oak surface, the grain running honest and straight under the shop light. Then I looked back at the 3 glasses. Something had shifted in the workshop. Not the light, not the temperature. Something in the quality of the silence. The way a room changes when a fact has been established in it that cannot be unestablished. I had built a career on reading that kind of change, on knowing the difference between a room where the answer was still uncertain and a room where the answer had arrived and was simply waiting for you to acknowledge it. The answer had arrived. I needed to find Margaret Yuen. Derek showed up on a Wednesday without calling first. In 33 years, my son had never once arrived at my door unannounced. Not as a teenager, not as a college student, not as an adult with his own address and his own schedule. He called before he came. He confirmed the time. He arrived within 10 minutes of when he said he would. These were not qualities I had taught him. They were qualities he had arrived at on his own. The particular consideration of a person who understood that other people's time had value. I had always been quietly proud of this about him. He knocked at 10:40 on a Wednesday morning, and I opened the door. And there he was. He looked like a man who had slept badly for several nights in a row and was managing the evidence of it. Pale around the eyes, the set of his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone carrying weight they have not distributed properly. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was smiling, the specific smile of a person who has decided in advance what expression to arrive with and is maintaining it through conscious effort. I said, "Derek, this is a surprise." He said, "I was in the area. Thought I'd check in." He was not in the area. Bellevue was 25 minutes from Northgate on a good traffic day. Nobody was in the area of my neighborhood by accident on a Wednesday morning. I stepped back and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way people do when they need something to hold. He asked about the pipes in the basement, whether I had called the plumber about the pressure issue he had mentioned in November. I said I had not gotten around to it. He nodded. Asked whether I needed anything from Costco. He was going this weekend anyway. I said I was fine for everything. Then he asked, "Have you been taking the vitamins?" He said it in the middle of a sentence about something else. The Costco question, I think, or something adjacent to it. Dropped in casually, the way you drop something you have been holding for a while and have finally decided to set down. I looked at him. He was looking at his coffee mug. I said, "Every morning. They're easy to remember. I take them with breakfast." This was the first lie I had told my son in 33 years. Not a complicated lie. Not a lie that required construction or maintenance. Simply a false statement delivered in a flat, even tone. The tone of a man reporting a fact. I watched his face while I said it. The change was small. A fraction of a second. The shoulders dropping a quarter inch. The jaw releasing slightly. The particular physical loosening of a person receiving information they needed. He picked up his coffee and drank, and when he set the mug down, he was looking at the table rather than the floor. He was relieved. I thought about the 3 glasses of water on my workbench. I thought about the color of the water. Pale yellow, the color of something that had been trying to go unnoticed. I thought about what it meant that my son was relieved to hear I was taking a supplement his girlfriend had selected and purchased and delivered to my kitchen table. I did not say any of this. I asked about his work. He answered the question and looked at his coffee. I asked about the apartment, whether the leak in the bathroom had been fixed. He said yes. Last month, the landlord finally sent someone. He looked at the window. We had been sitting at this table for 20 minutes, and he had not looked directly at me once. When Derek was 8 years old, he failed a spelling test and told me he had passed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and told me he had gotten 18 out of 20, and his eyes went to the floor the moment the words left his mouth. I had known immediately, not because the story was implausible, but because of the eyes, the specific, involuntary downward movement of a person whose body is reporting what their words are not. Some things do not change in 25 years. He stood up at 11:30 and said he should get going. I walked him to the door. He put his coat on and picked up his keys, and then stopped with his hand on the door frame and turned back. He said, "Dad, do you remember what you always told me about double-checking everything before you sign off on it?" He said it looking at me, directly at me, the first time in the entire visit. His eyes were steady and his voice was even, and there was something in both that I recognized as effort. The effort of a man saying the most he can manage to say. I said, "I remember." He said, "Okay." He nodded once, opened the door, walked to his car without looking back. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. The car backed out slowly, turned onto the street, moved away. I watched until it was gone. Then I closed the door and stood in the hallway and understood what had just happened. That question had not been a question. It had been a message. The only message my son could deliver without saying what he actually knew. In the only way a man could warn his father when warning his father was the most dangerous thing he could do. Double-check everything before you sign off. He had chosen those words from the 33 years of language between us, from the specific vocabulary of a father and son, and he had placed them in front of me and trusted me to know what to do with them. He was terrified, and he was trying anyway. In the only way left to him. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hand was still on the door. Then I went to the kitchen, found the notepad by the telephone, and wrote down Margaret Ewan's number from my call history. It was time to stop waiting for Sunday. Margaret Ewan lived on the 4th floor of a building on Beacon Hill that had no elevator and no intention of getting one. I found the address through Carol's old address book, a small spiral-bound notebook with a burgundy cover that I had not opened since the week after the funeral, when I went through Carol's desk looking for the insurance documents and found instead 40 years of handwritten names and addresses and the particular evidence of a life maintained through careful attention to other people. Margaret's entry was near the back, written in Carol's neat, leftward slanting hand. Margaret Ewan, 412 South Horton Street, apartment 4C. Below it, in smaller writing, a note I did not understand until I was standing on the sidewalk outside the building. 4th floor, no elevator. She says the stairs keep her honest. The building was 4 stories of red brick, the kind of construction that dated from the 1940s and had been maintained rather than renovated. The bones were good. The surfaces were worn. The whole thing had the settled, unpretentious look of a place where people actually lived rather than a place where people performed living. The lobby door was unlocked. The stairwell smelled of other people's cooking and decades of the same building holding the same air. I counted 41 steps to the 4th floor. I stood in the hallway for a moment before I knocked. The corridor was narrow and quiet. 4 doors on each side, the carpet the color of old moss. From behind one of the doors came the low sound of a television, a news program, the measured cadence of someone reporting something difficult in a practiced voice. From behind 4C, nothing. I knocked. She opened the door before the sound of the second knock had finished. Margaret Ewan was smaller than I remembered from the waiting room. Or perhaps the waiting room had given her a different scale, the scale of a public space that makes everyone look larger. In her own doorway, she was simply herself. A small woman of 76 in a gray cardigan, with white hair and dark eyes, and the unhurried stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that rushing did not change outcomes. She said, "I wondered when you would come. Come in." Not, "Who are you?" or "How did you find me?" She had been expecting me. The only question had been the timing. The apartment was warm and full in the way that apartments become when a person has lived in them long enough and cared enough to fill them with the right things. Bookshelves on 2 walls, organized with the precision of someone who read seriously and returned things to their exact place. African violets on the windowsill, purple, healthy, tended with the consistency of someone who remembered them without being reminded. A reading chair near the window with a folded blanket on the arm. The particular order of a life, arranged by a person who knew exactly what she needed and had stopped keeping anything she did not. Then I saw the photograph. It was on the wall beside the bookshelf, framed in plain dark wood. Black and white, the size of a paperback. 2 women in work clothes standing outside a building I recognized. The east entrance of the Boeing Everett facility. The one with the concrete overhang and the flagpoles. Summer from the way they were squinting. Both of them young, late 20s, maybe early 30s. One of them was Margaret. Younger, her hair dark, but recognizably her. The stillness was already there in her posture, the quality of a person who did not move without purpose. The other woman was laughing. She had turned slightly toward Margaret. Her weight shifted to one side. Her head tilted back with the full, unguarded laugh of someone who was not thinking about how they looked. Her hair was loose. Her face was open in a way I had not seen in a very long time. Carol was 28 years old in that photograph. I had 38 years of her face in my memory. In every light and season, in every mood and weather, in the particular morning light of our bedroom, and the particular evening light of the back porch, and the flat white light of the hospital in the last weeks. I had her face in all of those moments. What I did not have was this moment, this unguarded, full-body laugh, this version of her that existed before I knew her, that belonged to a friendship I had never been inside. Margaret had kept her on that wall for almost 40 years. I stood in front of the photograph for a long moment. Margaret did not say anything. She understood, I think, that this required its own time. Then she said, "Sit down, Walter. There is tea on the counter." I sat at the small kitchen table. The tea was already poured. She had known how long it would take me to climb 4 floors. I wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the woman across from me and waited. She said, "I was going to start at the beginning, but I think you need the most important part first. So I'm going to tell you what I heard at the nail salon, and then I'm going to tell you how I know it matters." She folded her hands on the table. The arthritis was worse than I had noticed in the waiting room. The knuckles enlarged, the fingers slightly curved, the hands of someone who managed pain as a daily condition rather than an event. She said, 3 weeks ago, I was at a nail salon on Rainier Avenue. I was sitting at the drying station when a woman sat down 2 chairs away and made a phone call. She was not trying to be quiet. People rarely are in nail salons. There is enough ambient noise that conversations feel private when they are not. She paused, looked at me steadily. She said, "The woman said, and I am going to give you her exact words because I wrote them down when I got home. The vitamins are ready. Just make sure he takes them every morning. He won't question it. Old men never check their vitamins." The tea in my hands was hot. I focused on the heat. Margaret said, "I recognized your name from the call. Carol had mentioned you at every lunch and every coffee for 20 years. When I heard your name, I looked at the woman more carefully. And I recognized her from a photograph Carol had shown me. A photograph of Derek and his girlfriend at Thanksgiving." She stopped. Let that settle. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going. the brief Seattle winter light that arrived without conviction and left without ceremony. In the photograph on the wall, Carol was still laughing at something just out of frame. Margaret said, "I didn't go home after the salon." She did not go home. Instead, she followed Natalie out of the nail salon and watched her get into a silver sedan parked on Rainier Avenue. She noted the license plate in the notes application on her phone. Slowly, with arthritic fingers that did not cooperate the way they once had, but accurately. Then she went home, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with a small spiral notebook and wrote down everything she had heard, word for word, while the memory was still exact. That was 3 weeks before the waiting room. In the 2 weeks between the nail salon and the morning she found me at Swedish Medical Center, Margaret Ewan had done something I would not have predicted and could not have asked for. She had conducted her own investigation. She told me this without drama, the way she told everything, as a sequence of facts in the order they had occurred, delivered in the measured voice of a woman who had spent 20 years in accounting and understood that the credibility of information depended on the precision with which it was presented. She had taken the bus to the neighborhood where Derek and Natalie lived. She had sat in a coffee shop on the corner with a view of their building's entrance. She had done this on 4 separate mornings, arriving at 8 and leaving at 11, nursing the same cup of tea and watching and writing in the spiral notebook. She opened a kitchen drawer and placed the notebook on the table between us. It was small, the kind sold in drugstores, wire-bound, with a mottled black cover. She had written the dates on the outside in her precise accountant's hand. I picked it up and opened it. The entries were meticulous. Dates, times, descriptions. Natalie leaving the building at 8:40, carrying a paper bag. Contents unknown. Natalie returning at 10:15 without the bag. A man Margaret did not recognize arriving at the building and leaving 20 minutes later. A phone call Natalie made on the sidewalk, duration approximately 4 minutes, during which she turned away from the street in the manner of someone who did not want her expression visible to passing traffic. The handwriting was difficult in places, the letters uneven, some of them requiring a second attempt. The particular struggle of hands that no longer did what they were told without negotiation. But every entry was complete. Not one had been abandoned mid-sentence. I looked up from the notebook. Margaret said, "I want to be clear about something. I had enough in that notebook to go to the police after the first week. The license plate, the conversation I overheard, the pattern of behavior I observed. That was sufficient for a report." I said, "Why didn't you?" She looked at me with the steady, dark eyes that I was beginning to understand were her default expression for situations that required honesty, delivered without softening. She said, "Because I knew what would happen." An elderly woman with a terminal diagnosis walks into a police station and reports that she overheard a conversation in a nail salon and then spent 2 weeks watching a building from a coffee shop. She does not have a recording. She does not have a photograph. She has a spiral notebook and a memory, and 3 months left to live. And the detective assigned to her report is going to be very kind and very thorough and do absolutely nothing with it. She paused. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone fully gray. She said, "Carol told me something once. She said you were the kind of man who needed to find things out for himself. She said if someone handed you the answer, you would spend all your energy protecting everyone else before you protected yourself. She said the only way to keep you safe was to make sure you were the one doing the finding." She let that sit. I thought about 38 years of Carol watching me work, watching me take apart systems that other people had declared unfixable and diagnose them from the inside out. She had watched me do it with engines and avionics and landing gear assemblies, and she had understood something about the way I was built that I had never articulated to myself. That I trusted conclusions I had reached more than conclusions I had been given. that I needed the evidence in my own hands. She had told Margaret this. She had told Margaret this, and Margaret had acted on it. I set the notebook down carefully on the table. The tea had gone cold in the mug. I did not notice until I reached for it. Margaret said, "I found you in the waiting room because I knew your appointment schedule. Carol used to mention your checkups. She was meticulous about making sure you kept them. I went to Swedish 3 times before that Tuesday. The first time I missed you. The second time the timing was wrong. Too many people, not enough space to say what needed saying. The third time I sat down beside you. I said, 'The handbag. At the waiting room. You sat down with a purpose.' She said, 'Everything I did had a purpose. I don't have the luxury of doing things without purpose anymore.' She said it without self-pity. As a fact, the way she said all facts. I looked at the notebook on the table between us. I thought about this woman. 76 years old, arthritic hands, terminal diagnosis, 4 bus rides to a coffee shop on a corner in the rain. Doing all of this because a woman she had eaten lunch with every Tuesday and Thursday for 20 years had asked her to watch over someone. I said, 'Margaret, how long do you have?' She looked at me steadily. She said, 'The doctors say 4 to 6 months. That was 6 weeks ago.' The room was very quiet. Then she said, 'Walter, there is one more thing I need to tell you. About Carol. About what she knew before she died. And I need you to hear it before you decide what to do next.' I put both hands flat on the table. The notebook was between them. Small, wire-bound, filled with the difficult handwriting of a woman who had negotiated with her own hands for weeks to write down what needed to be written. I said, 'Tell me.' Margaret folded her hands on the table and began. She said, 8 months before Carol died, Derek sent her an email. Not to you, to Carol's personal address. He told her that Natalie had been asking questions about the house, about the deed, about what would happen to the property after you were gone. He said Natalie had been pressuring him to find out whether your will could be changed. He said he did not know what to do. I said, 'Carol never told me.' Margaret said, 'No, she did not.' I looked at the photograph on the wall. Carol at 28, laughing at something just out of frame. I thought about what it meant to read an email like that alone, to carry it without putting it down in front of me. I said, 'Why didn't she tell me?' Margaret said, 'Because she knew exactly what you would do. You would have confronted Derek and cut Natalie out before she had done anything provable. Derek would have resented you for it. Natalie would have waited and found another way in. Carol did not want you to win the battle and lose your son in the same movement.' I said nothing. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going gray. Margaret said, 6 weeks after the email, we were both at the cancer center. She found me in the waiting area. She sat down and said, 'Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to say yes before I tell you what it is.' I said, 'What did you say?' Margaret said, 'I said yes, because it was Carol.' She paused. 'Let that settle.' She said, 'She told me about the email. She told me she believed Natalie was capable of something serious, and that she did not have enough time left to protect you herself. She said, and I am giving you her exact words, she said, 'If someone tries to hurt Walter, I need you to be the one who warns him. Watch first. Make sure you understand what you are seeing. Then find him. Promise me, Margaret.' The kitchen held the silence of a fact spoken aloud for the first time. I thought about Carol in a cancer center waiting room, managing her own dying, and spending part of that energy arranging for someone else's safety. I thought about the weight of what she had carried without telling me. The love that looked exactly like silence from the outside. I did not make a sound. I sat with my hands flat on the table and let it move through me, all of it. The 18 months of the second cup of coffee, the unfinished table, the particular silence of a house that knew how to hold its shape without the person who had given it that shape. She was dying, and she was still making sure I would be all right. Margaret did not try to fill the silence. She sat with it, the way people sit with hard things when they have learned that managing someone else's grief is not the same as respecting it. After a while, I said, "She knew. The whole time. She knew what Natalie was." Margaret said, "She suspected. She did not have proof. But Carol had very good instincts, and what she saw in Natalie was someone who calculated the value of things before deciding whether to want them." I nodded. I thought about the pot roast, the 2-second shoulder touch, the white box placed on the table with the casual precision of a decision already made. Margaret reached into the kitchen drawer and produced a small white envelope, sealed. My name on the front in Carol's handwriting. The neat, leftward slanting hand I knew from 38 years of grocery lists and birthday cards and the torn magazine page on my workbench. She said, "She left this the day she asked for my promise. She said to give it to you when the time was right." I looked at the envelope, my name in Carol's hand. The letters slightly smaller than her usual writing, the careful, precise letters of someone making sure each one was exactly right. I picked it up, did not open it. Margaret said, "You don't have to open it here." I put the envelope in my jacket pocket, stood up, looked at the photograph one more time. Carol at 28, laughing at something I would never know, in a version of herself I had never had access to. I said, "Thank you for all of it." She said, "Carol asked me to, but I would have done it anyway." I believed her completely. At the door I stopped, turned back. I said, "I'm going to call the FBI tonight." Margaret looked at me with the steady, dark eyes that had delivered every difficult thing in this room without flinching. She said, "I know. Carol said you would, once you had enough." I walked down the 4 flights of stairs and out into the evening air of Beacon Hill. The city moved around me, lit windows, passing cars, the ordinary machinery of 6 o'clock on a winter evening, indifferent to any particular story unfolding inside it. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the envelope in my pocket and Margaret's notebook under my arm. Carol had read Derek's email 8 months before she died. She had sat with that knowledge through every remaining Tuesday and Thursday lunch, through every Saturday morning coffee, through the last weeks in the hospital when I had held her hand and believed she was simply saying goodbye. She had been saying goodbye. She had also been finishing something she had started, making the last arrangements of a woman who understood that the people she loved would need more than grief when she was gone. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, did not start the engine. Then I took out my phone and dialed. The FBI field office picked up on the second ring. I said, "My name is Walter Briggs. I need to report an attempted poisoning. I have physical evidence and a witness. I can come in tonight." The voice on the other end said, "Can you come right now, Mr. Briggs?" I looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, Carol's handwriting in the amber light of the parking structure. I said, "I'm already in the parking lot." The FBI field office on 3rd Avenue looked exactly like a place where facts were taken seriously. No lobby art, no decorative plants, fluorescent lighting that made everything look the color of a decision that had already been made. The woman at the front desk checked my ID, made a call, and told me to sit. I sat in a chair against the wall and looked at my hands, and thought about how many times in my life I had sat in a room waiting to be told what happened next. Special Agent Sarah Okafor came down the hallway 4 minutes later. She was 41, compact and direct in the way of someone who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed and no more. Navy suit, hair pulled back, a legal pad under one arm, and a pen already in her hand. She introduced herself, shook my hand with the firm, brief grip of someone who did not use handshakes for anything except identification, and led me to a small office with 2 chairs and a desk and nothing on the walls. She sat down, put the legal pad on the desk, looked at me. She said, "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning." I told her everything. I started with the waiting room. Margaret, the warning, the specific words. I told her about Derek's visit, the white box, the vitamins placed on my kitchen table with the casual precision of something already decided. I told her about the measuring cup, the 3 glasses, the color of the water in the January light of my workshop. I put Margaret's notebook on the desk between us. Okafor did not write while I talked. She looked at me, the steady, evaluating attention of someone deciding, in real time, whether what they were hearing was credible. I had given depositions twice in my career, both times related to aerospace incidents, and I knew what a person looked like when they were listening to separate the facts from the interpretation. That was what she was doing. When I finished, she picked up the notebook, opened it, read 3 pages without expression. Then she set it down and picked up her pen. She said, "The capsules. Do you still have the ones you tested?" I said, 3 glasses in my workshop, covered, untouched since this morning." She wrote something, said, "I'm going to need those. I'm also going to need the remaining capsules from the box. Can you bring them in tomorrow morning?" I said I could. She wrote for 2 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. She said, "Mr. Briggs, if the lab confirms what you're describing, we will need your cooperation for approximately 2 weeks. During that time, I need you to behave exactly as you have been behaving. Accept the vitamins. Thank her for them. Do not change anything about your routine or your manner with either your son or his girlfriend. Can you do that?" I thought about 2 weeks of watching Natalie set things on my kitchen table with her careful, practiced hands. 2 weeks of saying, "Thank you, sweetheart," and meaning none of it. I said, "I've been doing it for 10 days already." Something moved in Okafor's expression. Not sympathy exactly. Something more operational than that. The look of someone who had just revised their assessment of the person across the desk. She wrote something on the legal pad. Then she said, "We'll run the capsules through the lab on priority. You should have preliminary results within 48 hours. I'll call you directly." She stood, held out her hand. She said, "You did the right thing coming in tonight, Mr. Briggs. Most people wait longer than they should." I shook her hand, said, "My wife arranged for me not to wait." Okafor looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. One nod, small and complete. The nod of someone who understood exactly what that sentence meant and did not need it explained. I drove home through the city. Seattle at 8 o'clock on a January evening. The rain-slicked streets, the lit windows of restaurants and apartments. The ordinary world doing its ordinary things. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going in. The house was dark, except for the lamp in the living room that I left on a timer. I went to the workshop first, bagged the 3 glasses carefully, and set them by the back door for the morning. Then I went inside, turned on the kitchen light, and stood at the counter. The white vitamin box was where Natalie had left it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I moved it 2 inches to the left, exactly where it had been, and went to make coffee. My phone buzzed on the counter. Natalie. A text message, sent with the cheerful precision of someone maintaining a performance on schedule. "Just checking in, Dad. Hope you're sleeping well. See you Thursday. Take your vitamins." A small yellow circle with a smiling face. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I typed, "Thanks, sweetheart. Feeling great." Sent it. Put the phone face down on the counter. I stood in the kitchen with the coffee I was not going to drink and looked at the dark window above the sink and thought about 48 hours. The lab results. Okafor's direct line programmed into my phone. 2 weeks of performing a version of my life that looked exactly like the real version from the outside. 38 years of engineering had prepared me for a great many things. It had not prepared me for this. For the specific, sustained effort of maintaining precision under conditions that had nothing to do with metal or measurement, and everything to do with the people I had loved longest. I turned off the kitchen light, went to the workshop, stood in the dark beside the unfinished table, and put my hand on the oak surface. Cool and smooth, and exactly what it was. 48 hours. Natalie arrived on Thursday at 10:15, with a canvas grocery bag over one arm and the smile she always arrived with. I opened the door before she knocked. I had been watching from the kitchen window, not from anxiety, but from the same instinct that made me check instruments before a system came online. Know what you are dealing with before it is in the room with you. She was wearing a cream-colored coat, her hair down, moving up the front path with the easy confidence of someone who had been making this walk for long enough to stop noticing it. She said, "Dad, you look great." I said, "I feel great. Come in." This was the first Thursday of the 2 weeks Okafor had asked for. I had spent the 48 hours before it the way I spent any preparation period before a critical task. Methodically, without rushing, making sure I knew exactly what I was doing and why. What I was doing was simple in theory and difficult in practice. Be the man Natalie expected to find. Be Walter Briggs, who took his vitamins every morning and was grateful for the attention and noticed nothing unusual about any of it. I had been that man for 10 days already. 2 more weeks was a matter of maintenance. She set the grocery bag on the counter and began unpacking. Fresh orange juice in a glass bottle. A container of something she called an adaptogenic blend, a word I had looked up and found unconvincing. A small paper bag from a bakery on Capitol Hill. She moved through my kitchen with the familiar ease that I had once called warmth and now understood as something else. The ease of a person who had decided this space was already hers and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table. She asked about my sleep. I said it had been good. She asked about my energy in the afternoons. I said I had been getting out to the workshop most days. She nodded and wrote nothing down, but I could see her filing the answers the way I filed instrument readings. Not for their surface content, but for what they indicated about the system's current state. She said, "Are you still taking the vitamins every morning?" I said, without fail. "I can already feel the difference in my knees." She smiled. The smile reached her eyes, and that was the part I found most impressive, in the cold, technical way that one finds impressive a thing that is very well made for a very bad purpose. She had practiced this until it was seamless. She said, "I'm so glad. Derek will be happy to hear it." She stayed for 40 minutes. She offered, briefly and without pressure, to help organize my financial files. Just to make things easier, she said. Just to take one thing off my plate. I said I had a system that worked for me. She said, "Of course, just a thought," and moved on without a visible reaction. That last part, the graceful retreat, the complete absence of resistance, was what stayed with me after she left. A person who cared whether they received a yes would push a little. A person who had other plans would wait. I watched her car pull out of the driveway and stood at the kitchen window until it turned the corner. Then I went to the workshop and stood at the bench and breathed for a moment. Okafor called at 9 that evening. She said, "The lab results came back this afternoon. I wanted to wait until I had the full report before I called you." I said, "What did they find?" She said, "Acetaminophen, high concentration, consistent across all 3 capsules. At the dosage level present, daily ingestion over a period of 90 to 120 days would produce progressive liver damage, presenting as natural age-related decline. Fatigue, cognitive softening, gradual organ failure. The kind of deterioration that a physician examining an elderly patient with no prior liver conditions would attribute to the normal processes of aging. I sat down on the stool beside the workbench. She said, "Walter." This was not improvised. The concentration is precise. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge designed this. It was built to look like nothing. I said, "How long have I been taking them?" She said, "You haven't been. But if you had started the day they were delivered and continued for 4 months, the liver damage would have been significant enough to affect your cognitive function. Enough to make a signature on a legal document questionable in retrospect, but not impossible to defend." I looked at the unfinished table in the far corner of the workshop. She said, "There is something else. When we ran the background check on Natalie as part of the preliminary investigation, we found a prior address in Portland, Oregon. A man named Gerald Hayes, 68 years old. He died in March of 2021. I said, "How?" She said, "Liver failure. Recorded as natural causes. We are looking into it." The workshop was very quiet. The shop light above the bench cast the same clean, even light it always cast. Honest and without preference, illuminating everything in the room with equal clarity. I said, "She has done this before." Okafor said, "We don't have confirmation yet, but yes, that is what we are looking at." I held the phone and looked at the 3 empty spaces on the workbench where the 3 glasses had stood until I bagged them 2 days ago. 3 glasses, 3 capsules, 3 identical results. I had looked at those results and thought, not vitamin C. I had not thought, not the first time. Okafor said, "Continue as planned, 2 more weeks. I'll be in touch every evening at 9. If anything changes, if her behavior changes, if Derek's behavior changes, anything at all, call me immediately." I said I would. She said, "You're doing well, Walter." I said, "My wife made sure I would be." I set the phone on the bench, put both hands flat on the oak surface of the unfinished table. The wood was cool under my palms, straight-grained, honest, exactly what it was. Gerald Hayes, 68 years old, Portland, Oregon. She had done this before. The second week was harder than the first, not because anything changed in what I was required to do. The performance was the same. The schedule was the same. Okafor's calls came at 9 every evening and lasted between 4 and 7 minutes and ended with the same instruction. Continue as planned. Nothing about the external requirements of the 2 weeks shifted. What shifted was internal. And internal shifts are the ones that cost the most because there is no instrument that measures them and no procedure for managing the accumulation. By the second week, I had said, "Thank you, sweetheart," 14 times to a woman who was poisoning me. I had accepted 3 additional deliveries of supplements I did not take. I had smiled at the right moments and asked about her work and said the vitamins were helping, and watched her file each answer with the careful attention of a person monitoring a system she had designed. 14 times. I counted them the way I counted everything that mattered. Natalie came on Tuesday of the second week. She was carrying a new box, different packaging from the first, a deeper blue, the same high-end restraint. She set it on the counter and said the previous formulation had been updated. This one had a higher absorption rate. She had specifically asked her supplier about it. I said, "That's very thoughtful. You always think of everything." She said, "I just want you to be healthy, Dad." She said it with the full warmth of someone who meant it. The eyes, the voice, the slight forward lean of genuine concern, all of it present, all of it constructed, all of it deployed with a precision that would have been remarkable in any other context. I thought about Gerald Hayes in Portland. I thought about whether he had also been told, I just want you to be healthy. Whether he had also said, thank you, and meant none of it, or whether he had simply believed her and never known the difference. I thought about that for the rest of her visit. She left at 11:30. I walked her to the door, said something warm, watched her car back out of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen sink and stood there for a moment with the water running over my hands. Not washing them, just standing with the cold water moving over my palms, feeling something real and immediate and honest. Okafor called at 9 and told me tomorrow was the day. She said the warrants had been processed and the operation was set for 7 in the morning. She told me to stay home and to behave exactly as I always did until I heard from her. I said, both of them? She said, both. I said I understood. We ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet. The new blue vitamin box was on the counter where Natalie had left it, placed with the same casual precision as the first one, in the same spot, 2 inches from the edge, as though there were a designated location for things she was leaving in my house. There was, I realized. There had always been. At 8:47, my phone rang. Derek. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings before I answered. He said, "Hey, Dad. Just calling to check in." His voice was even. Practiced even. The specific flatness of a man controlling something in his tone that wanted to be there. We talked for 6 minutes. He asked about the pipes in the basement. I said I had finally called the plumber. He said good. I asked about his work. He said it was fine. The ordinary words of a father and son who had run out of the language they actually needed and were using the language they had left. Before he hung up, he said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I love you." He said it the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to set down, regardless of the weight of setting it down. Not casually, not as punctuation, as a complete sentence that carried everything he could not say in the 6 minutes before it. I looked at the kitchen window. The dark glass showed me my own reflection. A 65-year-old man sitting at a table in a lit kitchen, alone, holding a phone. I said, "I know, son." A silence, the length of a breath held and released. He said, "Okay, good night, Dad." I said, "Good night." The line went quiet. I set the phone face down on the table. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. Not thinking exactly, not feeling exactly. Something between the two, the particular state of a man who has processed what can be processed and is simply waiting for what comes next to arrive. The blue vitamin box sat on the counter, 2 inches from the edge, exactly where she had put it. At 10:15, I got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to the workshop. I stood in the dark beside the unfinished table and put my hand on the oak surface the way I had been doing for the past 2 weeks. Not to check it, not to work on it, simply to feel something that was exactly what it appeared to be. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. I stayed in the workshop until midnight. Then I went inside, set my alarm for 5:30, and went to bed. I did not make 2 cups of coffee the next morning. I made 2 cups. I carried both of them out to the back porch. I sat down in the cold January air and held one in each hand and looked out at the backyard. The oak tree, the fence line, the workshop door with the rust stain above the handle. And I waited for 7 o'clock to come. At 6:58, I was sitting on the back porch with both cups of coffee when I heard the first car. Not from the front of the house, from the street that ran parallel to the block, the one I could not see from the porch, but could hear clearly in the January quiet. A car engine, then a second one, both moving at the specific, careful pace of vehicles that were not in a hurry because they did not need to be. I knew that pace. It was the pace of people who had done this before, and understood that urgency was for situations that had not been properly prepared. I did not go around to the front of the house. I sat on the back porch with both cups of coffee and looked at the backyard. The oak tree. The workshop door. The frost on the grass catching the first gray light of the morning. I had decided the night before that I would not watch. Not because I could not have watched. The front window was 20 feet away. But because I had spent 2 weeks performing this carefully, and I did not want the last act of the performance to be standing at a window watching the ending of something I had already seen coming. Some things you do not need to see to know they have happened. At 7:04, my phone rang. Okafor said, "It's done, Walter." I said, "Both of them?" She said, "Both." Natalie was taken into custody at 7:01. Derek at 7:03 at a separate location. He did not resist. He sat down on the floor of his entryway and stayed there until we helped him up. I looked at the second cup of coffee on the porch railing. Still warm, a faint curl of steam rising from the surface in the cold air. I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Derek is in custody, and his attorney has already been notified. Based on his level of cooperation during the investigation, the DA is prepared to offer a plea agreement. He will likely serve a reduced sentence contingent on full cooperation with the prosecution of Natalie. I'll have more detail for you by this afternoon." I said, "And Natalie?" Okafor said, "That is going to take longer. There is the matter of Portland." She said it with the careful flatness of someone about to deliver information they had been holding in reserve, waiting for the right moment. I understood that the right moment was now, the operation complete, the immediate crisis resolved, the space clear for what came next. She said, "Gerald Hayes was 68 years old. He lived alone in a house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. He was a retired civil engineer, widowed, no children. He met Natalie through an online social group for professionals in their 50s and 60s. They were in a relationship for approximately 8 months before his death in March of 2021. I said, "She was with him the way she was with Derek." Okafor said, "The relationship followed the same pattern. She moved into his home after 3 months. She integrated herself into his routines, his finances, his social connections. She was present at his medical appointments. When he died of acute liver failure at 68 with no prior liver conditions, the attending physician noted it as an unusual presentation, but attributed it to undetected chronic alcohol use. There was no toxicology screening because there was no reason to request one." I set my coffee down on the porch railing, carefully. The way you set down something you are holding too tightly. I said, "What did she get?" Okafor said, "His house, valued at $900,000 at time of death. She sold it 7 months later. There were no other beneficiaries, and the estate passed without contest. $900,000. A retired civil engineer in Portland who had met someone through a social group and believed, the way people believe things when they are alone and someone appears to want them, that he had been lucky. He had not been lucky. I thought about the pot roast. The correct formula, approximated by someone who had studied it without living it. The 2-second shoulder touch. The white box placed on the table with casual precision. I thought about how long she had been doing this. Not just the 8 months with Gerald Hayes, not just the 2 years with Derek. The architecture of it, the patience, the specific, sustained effort of becoming indispensable to a person before you became dangerous to them. Okafor said, "Walter, there is one more thing from Derek's deposition this morning. He stated that he attempted to warn you. He said he made a phone call approximately 3 weeks before the vitamins were delivered, during which he asked you whether you remembered your habit of double-checking everything before signing off." I said, "I remember." She said, "He stated it was the only warning he was capable of giving without Natalie's knowledge. He said he told himself that if you heard it and understood it, you would be all right. And if you did not hear it, then what happened next was not something he had caused. The logic of a man who had found a way to tell himself he was not responsible, while doing nothing to stop it. I did not say this to Okafor. I said, I heard it. She said, I know. It's in your original statement. A pause. The back porch was cold and still, and the frost on the grass was beginning to soften in the early light. She said, I'll call you this afternoon with the plea details. Take care of yourself today, Walter. I said, Thank you, Sarah. I ended the call. Sat for a moment with the phone in my lap. The city was waking up around me. Somewhere on the next block a dog was barking. A car was pulling out of a driveway. The ordinary Sunday morning machinery of a neighborhood that did not know anything had just changed on one of its streets. I picked up the second cup of coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I kept the second cup of coffee on the porch railing for the rest of that Sunday morning. I didn't pour it out. That was new. 3 days after the arrests, Sarah Okafor called again. Not from the field office number, from her personal cell. I noticed that. She asked if I had 20 minutes. I told her I had the rest of the morning. We finished the Gerald Hayes investigation, she said. I thought you deserved to hear it directly. I pulled the kitchen chair out and sat down. The workshop door was open. I could see the white oak table from where I sat. Sanded smooth now, the top boards fitted together, the legs waiting. Almost done. Gerald Hayes, I said. The man in Portland. Retired civil engineer. University of Portland, class of '78. Widower. One grown daughter in Phoenix, who he hadn't spoken to in 2 years over a property dispute. Okafor's voice was measured, factual. The kind of voice I recognized from my Boeing days. The voice of someone who had processed difficult information and learned to deliver it without flinching. He met Natalie through a continuing education course, urban planning and infrastructure. Hayes was auditing the class for something to do in retirement. Natalie was enrolled. I said nothing. I was running the math in my head. If Natalie graduated, or dropped out, around 2019, and Hayes died in March 2021, they were together for about 14 months, Okafor continued. She moved into his house in Laurelhurst in January 2020. He changed his will in April. She was named primary beneficiary. His daughter in Phoenix received nothing. And then he got sick. Liver failure. His primary care physician noted elevated enzyme levels in October 2020. By February 2021, he was in hospice. He died on March 14th. A brief pause. No toxicology was ordered. There was no reason to order one. He had a history of moderate alcohol use. The physician attributed the failure to that. I looked at the workshop. The measuring cup, the heavy-bottomed one Carol bought at Williams-Sonoma the year we moved into this house, was still sitting on the second shelf of the pegboard. I hadn't moved it. I didn't know why exactly. Maybe I wanted to remember what it felt like to hold evidence of something real. The house, I said, sold 9 months after Hayes died. $887,000. Natalie received the full proceeds as primary beneficiary. Another pause. Gerald Hayes' daughter has been notified. She'll have the option to file a civil claim, but the criminal case will proceed independently. I thought about Gerald Hayes. I'd never met him, never would. A retired civil engineer who liked urban planning and infrastructure, who trusted someone who seemed kind and interested, who changed his will in April and was gone by March. 14 months from introduction to death. He never knew. He probably thought he was lucky, late in life, to find someone who cared. Did he have a workshop? I asked. Okafor paused. I don't know. I can find out. It doesn't matter, I said. I was just wondering. There was something quiet between us for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Just the particular silence of two people who have looked at something ugly together and don't need to fill the space immediately. Derek's deposition confirmed he knew about Portland, Okafor said. Not the details. He says he didn't know Hayes died. But he knew Natalie had been involved with someone older before. He knew the relationship had ended with a financial benefit to Natalie. He told himself it was just the way she was. A careful pause. His word was charming. He said she was charming, and people gave her things. I closed my eyes. My son had known. Not everything, but enough to know what kind of person she was. And he had looked at that knowledge and chosen to set it aside. I understood how that happened. I understood it in the way you understand a structural failure after the fact. You can see exactly where the load was distributed wrong, exactly which joint gave first. Understanding it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. What happens to Derek now? I asked. The plea agreement stands. 3 years probation, mandatory counseling, full cooperation. He's moving back to Seattle. His attorney says he's already looking for an apartment in Wallingford. Wallingford. 6 miles from my house. Close enough to drive to, far enough to need to decide to. He wrote you a letter, Okafor said. He asked me to tell you it exists. He's not going to send it unless you want him to. I didn't answer that. I looked at the workshop again. One more thing, Okafor said. The vitamin C brand Natalie used, the commercial bottle, the one she used to disguise the capsules. We traced the purchase. She bought 3 bottles, one for your home, one for hers, and one that was shipped to a post office box in Portland 8 months before she met Derek. The air in the kitchen got very still. She was already planning, I said. It wasn't a question. We believe so. Yes. I thanked Sarah Okafor. I told her she'd done good work. She said she'd be in touch as the case moved toward trial. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I got up, walked to the workshop, picked up the sandpaper from the shelf, and went back to the oak table. There was still one section of the apron rail that needed finishing. I found the envelope in my jacket pocket that evening, after dinner. I hadn't forgotten it was there. That's the honest answer. I had thought about it every single day since Margaret placed it in my hands. Thought about it on the drive to the FBI field office. Thought about it during Natalie's visits when I was performing the role of a healthy man who had no reason to distrust anyone. Thought about it at 5:30 in the morning when I stood at the kitchen counter making 2 cups of coffee and waiting for the quiet to settle around me the way it used to when Carol was still upstairs asleep. I just hadn't been ready to open it. There's a difference between knowing something is waiting for you and being prepared to receive it. I had learned that difference the hard way over the past 18 months. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a long moment. Carol's handwriting on the front, my name Walter in blue ink, careful and unhurried. The same handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and anniversary notes. And the yellow sticky note she left on the coffee maker sometime in the winter of 2019 that read, "Don't forget to eat something real." That note was still tucked under the edge of the machine. I hadn't moved it in 18 months. I wasn't going to move it now. I made a cup of tea. I don't particularly like tea, but Carol always said it was the right thing to drink when you needed to slow yourself down and stop making decisions from inside your chest. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things that mattered. I sat down across from the envelope, held the mug with both hands until it was comfortable, and drank slowly. When I finished, I set the mug aside, picked up the envelope, and opened it. 2 pages, handwritten. Dated 14 months before she died. Walter. If you're reading this, Margaret kept her promise, and something has happened that I was afraid might happen. I'm sorry I didn't tell you myself. I thought I had more time to find the right words, and then I ran out of time. The way I kept running out of it near the end. 8 months ago, Derek sent me an email. He didn't mean it as a warning. I don't think he fully understood what he was telling me. He said Natalie had been asking questions about the house, about whether your name was the only one on the deed, about what happens to a property when someone passes without having updated their estate documents. He thought she was being practical. He said she was just the kind of person who liked to understand how things worked before they needed to. I know that kind of person, Walter. I worked alongside that kind of person for 30 years at Boeing. They don't ask those questions out of practicality. They ask because they are already building something in their mind, and they need accurate measurements before they begin. I didn't tell you because I knew what you would do. You would go straight to Derek. Derek would tell Natalie, and Natalie would simply wait and recalibrate and find another way in. She's patient. I could see that in the 2 times I met her. The kind of patient that doesn't flinch. The kind that recalculates quietly and starts again without letting anything show on her face. So I asked Margaret to watch. And I asked her to warn you if anything happened to me, especially if Derek came to you with something that seemed like a gift meant to help you. I want you to understand something about Derek before you decide what to do next. What he allowed to happen came from weakness, not from cruelty. Derek loves you. He has always loved you in that helpless, wide-open way that makes him easy for the wrong people to use. You've known this since he was a boy. He needs someone to follow, and for most of his life that person was you. Then he followed the wrong person, and he didn't know how to find his way back. That is its own kind of tragedy. But it is not the same thing as him deciding to hurt you deliberately, with full understanding of what he was doing. Please don't let her take him from you completely. Whatever she has done, and I suspect it is worse than Derek knows, he is still the boy who used to fall asleep on the workshop floor while you worked late on your projects. He is still your son. What she is, Walter, is not his fault. I've left something for you in the workshop. Under the 3rd floorboard from the left, near the base of the south wall. You'll know what it is. Finish the table. I mean that literally, not only as a metaphor, though it works as one too. Finish it. The house needs a table, and I think by the time you read this, you'll need to finish it as well. All my love, always. Carol. I sat with the letter for a long time after that. I couldn't tell you how long. The kitchen light changed from pale evening gray to the heavier dark of full night without my noticing. At some point I got up and turned on the lamp above the table because I realized I had been sitting in the dark, which is the kind of thing that happens when you are entirely somewhere else inside your own mind. I read the letter 3 times. The first time I read it like a man receiving information. The second time I stopped at the boy who used to fall asleep on the workshop floor and had to set the pages down and press both hands flat on the table and just breathe for a while. The third time I read it straight through to the end without stopping, and when I finished, I folded it carefully back along its original creases and returned it to the envelope. Then I walked to the workshop. The floorboard was exactly where she said. 3rd from the left, south wall. I laid that subfloor myself when I converted the garage in 2004, and I knew every board the way you know the layout of something you built with your own hands from raw material. I took the flathead screwdriver from the pegboard, worked the board up slowly and evenly, and reached into the space below. A small tin box, the kind that once held shortbread cookies at Christmas, with a faded tartan pattern on the lid, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. Inside, a photograph and a small folded piece of paper. The photograph was the 2 of us at Crater Lake, summer of 1997. Carol in a red jacket, laughing at something just out of frame to her left. I'm standing beside her with the expression of a man who understands completely that he is the luckiest person in that photograph, and possibly in the entire state of Oregon. I sat down on the workshop floor with the photograph in my hands. The concrete was cold through my jeans. I didn't move for a long while. Then I set the photograph carefully on top of the tin and unfolded the piece of paper. 4 words. Carol's handwriting. Blue ink. The same pen as the letter. I knew you'd finish it. I started on the table the next morning at 6, not because I had planned to. I woke at 5:30 the same as always, made 2 cups of coffee, drank the first one standing at the kitchen window, watching the oak tree in the backyard catch the early light. Then I carried the second cup to the workshop, set it on the corner of the workbench, and picked up the hand plane without thinking about it. Some mornings, the body knows what it needs to do before the mind gets around to deciding. The apron rail on the south side had been sitting unfinished for 11 months. I had shaped it, cut the mortises, fitted the tenons. All the structural work was done. What remained was surface work. Smoothing the face of the rail until it matched the rest of the table. It was the kind of task that required patience more than skill. You work the plane in long, even strokes, and you let the wood tell you when it's ready. You don't rush it. Rushing surface work is how you end up with something that looks finished from a distance, but feels wrong the moment you run your hand across it. I worked for about 90 minutes before I stopped and looked at what I had. The table was done. Not almost done. Not close. Done. All 4 legs square and solid, the top boards fitted and flush, the apron rails smooth on every face. I ran my palm across the surface the way I used to run my hand along a fuselage panel at Boeing, feeling for irregularities too small for the eye to catch. There were none. The white oak was warm under my hand, pale gold in the workshop light, with a grain that ran long and straight through the center boards and curved gently near the edges where Carol had liked it most. She had shown me the photograph from the magazine and pointed specifically to that detail. "I like that it looks like it grew that way," she had said. "Like it was always going to be a table." I stood there with my hand on the surface for a long time. Then I went inside and called Derek. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been awake. It was 7:43 in the morning on a Tuesday, and my son answered his phone on the second ring with the careful, flattened voice of a man who had been lying in the dark, waiting for something. "Dad," he said. That was all. Just my name. The way he said it carried about 4 years of weight. "I finished the table," I said. A long silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Thinned out in a way I recognized from when he was a boy and trying not to cry in front of me. "Carol's table," he said. "Yeah." Another silence. This one was different from the first. The first silence had been braced, defensive, the silence of someone waiting to be hit. This one was softer. The kind of silence that opens up when something you've been carrying gets set down. "I sent you a letter," Derek said. "I gave it to Agent Okafor. She said she'd only pass it along if you ask for it." "I know," I said. "She told me." "You don't have to read it," he said. "I just needed to write it. I needed you to know it exists. You can burn it if you want. I mean that seriously. You can burn it, and I'll understand." I looked at the workshop through the kitchen doorway. The table was visible from where I stood, the top catching the morning light coming through the single east-facing window, the grain running long and gold and straight. "I'm not going to burn it," I said. Derek didn't say anything for a moment. When he did speak, it was quiet, careful, like a man placing weight on a floorboard he isn't sure will hold. "I knew something was wrong," he said. I didn't know what she was doing. I want you to understand that. But I knew she wasn't. I knew she saw things in ways I didn't want to look at too closely. And I kept not looking. I kept telling myself it wasn't what I thought it was. "I know," I said. "That's not an excuse. I know that too." He went quiet again. Outside the kitchen window, The oak tree was moving slightly in the morning wind, the bare branches just beginning to show the first faint edge of bud. Another few weeks, and it would leaf out the way it did every spring, the way Carol had watched it do every spring from the same window I was standing at now. "Your mother knew," I said. "She left me a letter. She knew about Natalie's questions a long time before either of us did." Derek's breath changed on the other end of the line. A sharp, quiet intake. Then nothing for several seconds. "She never said anything to me," he said finally. "She was protecting you," I said. "The way she always did. The way she always protected both of us from things we weren't ready to see." I heard him exhale slowly. The sound a person makes when something they've been holding in their chest for a long time finally releases its grip. "Dad," he said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are," I said. "Come see the table when you're ready. Not yet, but when you're ready." "Okay," he said. "Okay." We stayed on the line for another minute without speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said the necessary thing and don't need to fill what comes after it with noise. I hung up, poured the second cup of coffee down the drain, and went back to the workshop. The table was waiting. The morning I moved the table into the dining room, I made 2 cups of coffee. Old habit. 41 years of marriage had built that habit so deep into my hands that I stopped thinking about it sometime around 1987 and never started again. The coffee maker ran, the first cup filled, then the second. I set them both on the counter and stood looking at them, the way I had stood looking at them every morning for the past 19 months. 1 cup I would drink, 1 cup that would go cold and get poured down the drain. Except this morning I picked them both up and carried them to the dining room. The table looked right in that space. I don't know how else to say it. Some things look correct in a technical sense. Dimensions match, proportions work. And some things look right in a way that goes past measurement. The white oak sat under the morning light coming through the east window, and the grain ran long and pale gold through the center boards and curved at the edges the way Carol had pointed to in the magazine photograph 12 years ago. Like it was always going to be a table, she had said. Standing there with both cups in my hands, I thought she was right. It looked like it had always been there. Like the room had been waiting for it and had simply been patient. I set 1 cup at the head of the table. I set the other at the chair to its left. Then I sat down and drank my coffee. The second cup sat across the corner from me, steam rising in the morning light, going the same way it always went, slowly, quietly, without complaint. I let it. I didn't reach for it. I just let it be there the way Carol had always been there. Present, warm, and then, after a time, still. When I finished my cup, I sat for a while longer without moving. 3 weeks later, Derek came to see the table. He called the night before to ask if it was still all right. I told him it was. He arrived at 9 in the morning with a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks from his new apartment in Wallingford. The same bakery Carol used to walk to on Saturday mornings when she wanted something that wasn't homemade. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. He stood in the dining room doorway for a moment before he came in. Looking at the table the way you look at something that means more than it should, technically speaking. Then he walked to it and ran his hand along the top the same way I had run my hand along it in the workshop. Slowly, palm flat, feeling the grain. "It's beautiful, Dad," he said. "Your mother picked it," I said. "I just built what she chose." Derek nodded. He kept his hand on the table. His jaw was working in the way it had worked since he was a boy when he was trying to hold something back. "I read her letter," I said. "The one she left for me." He looked up. "She wasn't angry at you," I said. "I want you to know that. She understood how it happened. She wrote about it carefully, and she was not angry. She was just your mother." Derek pressed his lips together and looked back down at the table. His hand was still resting on the surface. I let the silence sit. "I've been going to counseling," he said after a while. "The sessions the plea agreement required, but also extra ones, on my own." He paused. "The counselor says I have a pattern of choosing authority figures to follow because I never trusted my own judgment. She says I'm working on it." "Good," I said. "She also said I should tell you something directly." He looked at me. "She said I should stop waiting for the right moment and just say it." "Then say it," I said. "I love you, Dad. I should have protected you. I didn't. I'm going to spend a long time understanding why I didn't, and that's on me. But I love you, and I'm glad you're here." I looked at my son standing in the dining room, with his hand on the table his mother had chosen, and his jaw working the way it had worked since he was 9 years old. And I thought about what Carol had written. "He is still your son." She had known, even at the end, what the essential true thing was. She had always known which part of a structure was weight-bearing and which was just surface. "I know you do," I said. "Sit down, have some coffee." He sat at the chair to the right of me. I poured from the carafe I'd brought from the kitchen. We ate the pastries from the bakery bag. We talked about his apartment in Wallingford, about the counselor, about a woodworking class at the community center he had seen advertised and thought I might like. We talked the way people talk when they are carefully, deliberately choosing to build something new from materials that have been through a great deal of stress. After he left, I sat at the table alone for a while. I thought about Carol. I thought about Gerald Hayes, the retired civil engineer in Portland, who never had this morning, who never got to sit at a table with his coffee and feel the particular relief of something survived and something repaired. I thought about Margaret Ewan, 4 flights up on South Horton Street, keeping a promise in a wire-bound notebook because Carol had asked her to. I thought about the yellow sticky note still tucked under the edge of the coffee maker in the kitchen. "Don't forget to eat something real." I got up, went to the kitchen, and made breakfast. 1 cup of coffee. The right amount for 1 person, measured correctly. Nothing wasted. It was enough. If you were Walter, would you have forgiven Derek? That's the question I keep coming back to. Not Natalie. Natalie is easy. What she did has a name and a sentence and a courtroom and a door that locks from the outside. She made her choices with full knowledge of what they were. But Derek is harder. Derek is the question that doesn't have a clean answer. Because he loved his father, and he looked the other way, and most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, have done some version of that at least once. Loved someone and looked the other way, because looking directly at the truth would have cost us something we weren't ready to pay. Would you have let him back in? Would you have called him the morning after the arrest and said, "Come see the table when you're ready"? Would you have poured him a cup of coffee and told him to sit down? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now, I want to tell you something about Carol Briggs. Carol never got to sit at that table. She chose the wood from a magazine photograph. She pointed to the grain and told Walter she liked that it looked like it had always been going to be a table. Like it was already a table before it was cut, before it was shaped, before anyone put a hand to it. She never saw it finished. She ran out of time before she could. But she made sure the man who built it would still be alive to finish it. That is what love looks like when it is doing its most important work. Not grand gestures, not declarations made in the easy moments. A promise asked of an old friend in a cancer center waiting room. A sealed envelope placed under a floorboard. 4 words written in blue ink on a folded piece of paper, left for a man she knew would eventually find his way back to the workshop. I knew you'd finish it. If someone in your life has ever loved you that quietly, tell them. Or tell us about them in the comments below. I think this story deserves that kind of conversation. If this story reached you somewhere real, subscribe. The next story is already waiting, and it starts the way all the important ones do, with something that looked exactly like kindness. Take care of yourself out there. See you in the next one.